Friends, I welcome you to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It is not difficult for you, but it is pleasant for me. And we're starting. Dawn slid into the driver's seat of her Honda Accord. Her whole body ached from head to toe after the nearly 3-hour workout she had just gone through. But today, she didn't spend the afternoon with her husband. That morning, he flew away on a business trip for 3 days and 2 nights. She checked into a smelly 24-hour motel room with Lori's older brother, her work colleague, Lyle. Lyle left her jaw and throat, like the rest of her body, throbbing and pretty battered. Lyle was a 38-year-old salesman who visited his sister and her family once a year. Apparently, Lyle enjoyed the status of a beloved uncle to his entire family and was known for his exciting adventures, which he enthusiastically shared with his nieces and nephews. They were looking forward to his annual visits. Lyle's highlight was to use sweet, mature married women and turn them into his fools for a day. Visiting his siblings and their families all over the country, Lyle urged them to introduce him to at least one married woman in one visit. A couple of years later, the legend of Lyle Harris turned into a superhero tale. Many of Lori's married colleagues have been debating for 12 months whether they should take the risk and meet with him on their next visit. It was the 5th year since Lori had joined their company, and Lyle was going to visit them next month. It's also been 4 years since Dawn started hearing about an incredibly erotic day spent by her colleagues when Lyle was going in and out of one of their thirsty holes. 2 of them boasted that they had taken it into their own hands. Chris was supposed to go on tour, and he had a few days to recuperate, and Dawn decided to do something she had never dreamed of, to change. Dawn started thinking about having an affair with Lyle after her close friend told her about her adventure last year. Joe tried to count the number of moments she had experienced, but couldn't give an exact figure. All she knew was that it was by far the best love experience of her life. After the date, Joe rededicated herself to her loving and faithful husband and their family. She swore that it was a one-time thing and would never happen again, and most importantly, that this secret memory would remain with her forever. Almost a year later, Joe's incredible experience had no effect on her marriage or family. She said that the love she spent with her husband was better than ever. Dawn reasoned that if she was careful and Chris was out of town, she would like to try what several of her friends had tried. What were the chances that someone as careful as she was would ever be caught? Having agreed with Lori that she and Lyle would have a play date, she secretly marked this day in her calendar with the word event. Dawn giggled, and her labia moistened as she changed the designation to event with a capital letter. If Lyle had been half as good as they said he was, she would have remembered this day forever. Dawn later admitted to herself that love wasn't half as good as she had imagined. He was 10 times better. When their office came to life on Monday morning, Dawn received a message from a man who was not on her contact list. The message read, "I was looking forward to our day together. Lori assured me that we would have fun. Get a room at the Rainbow Motel on Queen Street in Southington. Send me the room number. I'll be there at noon sharp." Dawn arrived at the motel, paid cash for a 6-hour stay, and was forced to endure the smirk and gaze of the smelly man with a cigar who checked her in. This was definitely not the Marriott hotel she was used to traveling with her husband Chris. Half an hour before Layla's arrival, Dawn changed into a short summer cotton dress. She walked slowly around the room. Her fears skyrocketed when Lyle was 5 minutes late, and 10 minutes later she was furious. When her phone rang at 12:22 p.m., Dawn read, "It is confirmed that number 24. I will be gone for 10 minutes. Be 100% naked when I come, or I'll leave." Fuming is the best description of how Dawn heard a knock on the door almost 20 minutes later. She was naked when she opened it a crack. She had seen pictures of Lyle, but she had no idea how big he was. "Lyle? What is it?" she asked. "Who the hell else could it be? Open the damn door, Dawn." Removing the chain, Dawn opened the door and stepped aside. Lyle was certainly handsome, but at the same time he looked demanding, almost threatening. His gaze reminded her of the pervert who put her up in a motel. "He's looking at me like I'm a piece of meat," she thought for a moment before realizing, "I guess I'm looking at him the same way." "Turn around. Do it slowly," Lyle ordered. Dawn stood on solid ground, slowly surveying Lyle from all sides of her 44-year-old body. She knew she looked 10 years younger. With a height of 165 centimeters and a weight of 65 kilograms, Dawn was gorgeous. Blonde hair and blue eyes accentuated a typical American face. She was stunned when he told her, "I'm surprised that my sister brought us together. You're much older than most of my girls." It was as if a switch had been flipped in her brain. She would show him, and she would be the best married cheater he had ever used. A few minutes later, when Dawn's tongue finally left his mouth, Lyle praised her. "Not bad. Why the hell am I letting him do this?" Dawn thought. She grabbed the waistband of his trousers before her knees touched the floor. The button on his jeans easily undid. The zipper parted, and the jeans fell off his waist with a jerk. The next 90 minutes passed in a blur. They made love nonstop in 5 or 6 poses, which Dawn was well acquainted with during her marriage to Chris. They ended the second session with Dawn kneeling unsteadily while Lyle used her. Dawn woke up after a very short 20-minute nap. She heard the sound of running water in the shower and realized that Lyle was cleaning himself up. She wanted to go to the toilet, and since he had already destroyed all her inhibitions, Dawn pushed open the door, went to the toilet, sat down and let the urine flow. It didn't take long for him to become as hard as a stone. Lyle took Dawn's hand and led her to the dressing table. Dawn followed his instructions and bent down, placing her hands on the lid of the locker. When he pushed her right leg, she spread her feet wide. Lyle's legs were pressed against Dawn's leg in a wide-open position, and his arms and body weight were pinning her against the countertop. "Look at me," Lyle growled. When Dawn looked in the mirror, he continued, "We can do it the easy way or the hard way. What do you prefer?" Dawn was scared to death and couldn't answer. "I'm waiting for an answer," he demanded. "Good. Easy. Please make it easier." With a sinister laugh, Lyle told her, "Look at me." Looking in the bathroom mirror, it was easy to see that Dawn was terrified. Half an hour later, they both showered, dressed, and were ready to leave. They didn't say more than a few words. When Dawn got to the parking lot, she expected to hear a thank you or something similar. Instead, Lyle said, "Next year I want to use Virginia McDaniel. I hope that you will help my sister and this will happen." Lyle bent down, kissed Dawn on the lips, walked to his car, and drove away. A few moments later, when Dawn was already sitting in her car, she opened the calendar on her phone. She smiled, about to delete the event from today's schedule, and thought, it was an event with 5 capital letters. Chris's event is with a capital letter. 29 months later. My alarm went off at 4:45 and the daily game started. I listened to Toby Keith's classic Beer for My Horses for a minute before I heard a thud. Buck, my 11-year-old Australian shepherd, jumped up at the foot of our bed. She sat silently at the foot of the bed right between my wife and me for about a minute before her tail began to drum slowly and rhythmically on the wooden frame. The blows grew faster and the sound louder as Buck wagged her tail harder. When I growled, "Why the fuck did you get up so early?" Buck threw herself on my chest and started licking my face. It was the beginning of a new day at the Harrington house. December in Connecticut is cold, and temperatures can range from 5 to 15 degrees. As was my habit, I checked the weather before going to bed. 2 hoodies, a pair of thick sweatpants, socks, and sneakers would be enough for an hour of morning exercise. Buck and I have a set daily routine, and 2 or 3 minutes after my feet hit the floor, I walked out the door, accompanied by my dog. 11 years later, Buck and I were on autopilot heading to the park next door, a kilometer away. The first sign that something had changed was Buck's growl. I looked at the dog, followed her gaze, and together we saw 2 men in uniform getting out of a sedan parked at my curb. I remember my thoughts exactly. I was incredibly excited. My son came home on vacation from the Marines. He gave us a surprise and brought 2 friends with him. When 5 and then 10 seconds had passed, and Danny still didn't get out of the back seat of the car, I realized with horror that Danny wasn't on vacation. He won't be coming home today, or ever again. I will never see my son again. Stunned, I met the U.S. Marine Corps alert group halfway home. If I don't take the dog out for a morning walk, he won't leave us alone. I looked at my watch and said, "Could you find a Dunkin' Donuts store and have a coffee? Let's meet at 6:30. "Yes, sir," was the immediate reply, before the captain and sergeant turned around and quickly left. With tears in my eyes, Buck and I headed to the park. We entered the park, and Buck went to inhale the various smells left by the animals that roamed the field at night. I sat down on a bench and thought about my 20-year-old son with a broken heart. It was like we had a completely different relationship. For the first 18 years, we had a normal family, or at least as normal as I could have dreamed of. Dan was the perfect man. He did well enough in school to be accepted into several colleges and universities well above the average level. He was a good athlete and had been playing on the high school football, basketball, and baseball teams for the last 2 years. And he could sing. Oh my God, how he could sing. In his senior year, he played the male lead in the musical production The Sound of Music, staged by the theater department of our high school. Dan was a productive, normal, well-rounded kid, but in the spring, when he started his senior year of high school, something happened. In a short period of time, he completely cut his mother out of his life. I tried to intervene, but for the first time, Dan didn't want to talk to me. When Dan started acting aggressively and insulting Dawn, I insisted on my own and demanded to explain what was going on. I was stunned when Dan got up from the kitchen table and left the house. He hasn't been home for 3 days. Dawn and I have been racking our brains trying to identify Dan's problem. We talked to his friends, teachers, coaches, and other people, but no one had the slightest idea about any problems. When he finally returned home, we sat down together. I decided not to insist, but I told him that I was not going to put up with his gross disrespect for my mother. Using an old saying, I told Dan, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. That's when the freezes began. He was close to me, like good old Dan, but he didn't say a word to Dawn. The silence towards Dawn continued throughout the entire ceremony of his admission to high school and until the 3rd week of July. It was Wednesday evening when I heard Dan come into the kitchen. Dawn and I listened to music and read in our living room. I assumed Dan had gone down the back stairs and was in his bedroom until he cleared his throat. When I looked up and saw him standing in the kitchen doorway, he asked, "Can we talk?" I replied, "Of course," and getting up from my chair. I was stunned when he looked at Dawn and asked, "All of us?" Dawn and I exchanged curious glances and followed Danny into the kitchen. When he handed me a bank check for $1,000, I asked, "It's not that I don't want to take your money, but what is it for?" "This is a non-refundable portion of the tuition that you paid for Boston College. I've given up college and won't be enrolling in September. The college will send you the rest, and you will receive it within 2 weeks." I was confused and bombarded Dan with a series of indecisive questions. "Did you give up your studies? Aren't you going to Boston? I think it's too late to pay back any of the nearly $10,000 we spent." Dan told us, "There are several reasons why a family can receive almost full compensation, including the death of a family member or a serious illness." Dawn interrupted him and said, "This does not apply to us." In the few seconds they were talking, I remembered reading about a contract with Boston College printed in small print. I was able to answer, "Or about military service." Dawn turned her head in my direction and just as quickly turned back to Danny. She demanded, "You're not going to join the Army?" I noticed that Dawn relaxed a little when Dan said, "I never said that I was going to join the Army." Dawn had no idea, but I knew what was going to happen. I followed in the footsteps of my dad and grandfather and enlisted in the Marines. Dan let us digest his shocking statement before he said, "I had a physical a few weeks ago. I begin basic training in 3 weeks at the Recruit Training Center on Parris Island, South Carolina. You're not going, and that's the end of our discussion. You're going to college." My mind was still spinning, and I was focused on the tabletop as Danny explained to his mom, "That's the funniest thing about the Marine Corps. They didn't send me invitations for basic training. They don't say please. I obey a military order and can either show up on time or go to a military prison. Aren't you going to say something?" I could feel Dawn's eyes boring into the top of my head. I shrugged, looked at Dan, and asked the only question that mattered. "Why?" I needed to know. It was Danny's turn to stare at the tabletop. There was a pleasant silence, broken from time to time by Dawn's sobs. After a few minutes, Danny sighed and told us, "I need to grow up. I want to grow up. I need to become a man." I realized that this is not all. When I thought Dawn was going to say something, I reached across the table, took her hands and, looking into her eyes, asked her to be quiet. Dan continued, "You know it wasn't like that for a while. I've never been so angry or confused. The worst part is that I can't talk to you about it. I don't have the courage to get together with my family. I can't do that. Dawn asked. Are you gay? I could tell from the look in Dan's eyes that his answer to Dawn's completely ridiculous question would be disgusting. I slammed my hand on the table and, channeling the anger that Dawn's question had aroused in me, I asked Dan, so you're running away? You weren't listening to me, Dad. I shrugged my shoulders in confusion when he explained. I'm striving for something towards masculinity. I decided that 3 years of service in the United States Marine Corps was the fastest way to achieve this. My memories were interrupted when Buck nuzzled my leg. I grabbed my trusty bat and pulled an old tennis ball covered in saliva out of my pocket. Using the bat, I hit the ball to the other end of the park. Buck found the ball in the pre-dawn darkness and brought it to me. Chasing a well-worn tennis ball seemed to be Buck's favorite activity that day. I think Buck was grumbling because we went home from the park a few minutes earlier than usual. As I walked, I tried to clear my mind completely, knowing that the next few hours and days would be devoted to another world. After making coffee, I went up to the second floor and went to Dawn's bed. I leaned over and kissed her on the cheek. Give me a few more minutes, Chris. I replied, you need to get up at dawn. Visitors will come to us in the next half hour. Wait a minute. What? I told her, I'm going to take a quick shower, and closed the bathroom door behind him. I reasoned as follows. I want to give Dawn a few more happy moments. I washed and rinsed my mouth in 2 minutes, dried myself, and when I entered our bedroom, Dawn was pulling a sweater over her head. What's going on, Chris? Tears were streaming down my face when I told her. The Marine Corps alert team will be here in a few minutes. Notification. That was all Dawn said before she realized our lives had changed forever. I took 3 quick steps and hugged my wife tightly. I was afraid she was going to fall. We cried together before I suggested we go downstairs. When we went down the stairs, I looked out the window and saw that the team car had returned. Dawn and I went out on the porch of our house together. The captain and the sergeant immediately got out of the car. When they came up to us, the captain said, Mr. and Mrs. Harrington, I'm Captain Peter Lewis, and I'm here with Sergeant Craig Malloy. Can we come in? Captain? I asked. Can I ask the sergeant for a favor? I could barely control my voice when I looked at Sergeant Malloy and asked, Could you please? I couldn't finish and instead nodded my head towards the flagpole at the edge of our yard. The Old Glory was illuminated in the early morning darkness and proudly floated in the air. The sergeant understood everything at once. Dawn and I hugged tightly, and Captain Lewis stood at attention and saluted when our flag was at half-mast. The next few hours passed in a blur. We knew Dan was in Syria. We were told that he was part of the patrol. An armored personnel carrier riding in front was blown up by a roadside bomb and caught fire. Dan ran out of the car to save his teammates when the second bomb exploded. Our son died on the spot. When the Marines had filled out the initial paperwork and were ready to leave, Captain Lewis asked me to escort him to his car. We left the house and were standing on the road when he took an envelope out of his pocket and handed it to me. I read my name, neatly written in Dan's handwriting. Dan's instructions were under my name. Please destroy this letter if it cannot be delivered to my father personally. When I got home, I threw the envelope on the table in my home office. I was in too much pain to read Dan's message, so I decided to wait for dawn and go to bed. Later that evening, after drinking 3 glasses of bourbon, I sat down at the table, opened the envelope, and read, My dear Dad, I'm sorry you're reading this letter. I regret a lot of things, but most of all I regret the pain that you have to go through. I hope I can help you deal with your grief, but I don't think it's possible. In fact, I'm afraid I'm going to make this terrible day even worse for you. Now, as I write to you, I do not know the circumstances of my death. I pray that I do something good, something noble, something worthy of a United States Marine. The hardest thing I can tell you is that no matter how I died a coward, at least in my eyes. I admire a lot about you, but most of all I admire your ability to face your problems. I appreciate the hundreds of face-to-face conversations we've had. You helped me figure out my problems. I also appreciate our family conversations. You always took the initiative in your own hands. You've never shied away from any topic. You took the bull by the horns and bravely solved your problems, my problems, Mom's problems, and our family's problems. I love you for that. When I was growing up, I tried to imitate your best qualities. However, I didn't have enough. I really missed your problem-solving skills. I was a coward and couldn't talk to my father about breaking off my relationship with my mother. I was a coward when I didn't talk to you before joining the Marines and skipped college. And I'm a coward today because I'm writing to you. A man would look you in the eye and explain why I needed to join the Marines. Perhaps if I had talked to you about it, I would have overcome my fears and become a person you could be proud of. Dad, Mom is a cheater. A few weeks before graduating from high school, I saw a text message that came to my mother's phone. I wasn't peeking. The message was rude and confirmed that Mom had a date in the motel room. The date was set for a few weeks later. That's when I started keeping quiet with her and finding excuses to stay with my friends. I was avoiding my mom. I knew it was going to be bad when the date time came and you left town for a few days. I skipped school and followed my mom to work. I followed her again when she left work late in the morning and went to one of those shitty motels in Southington. I watched her enter the office and then head into the room. About an hour and a half later, a younger guy knocked on the door and entered the room. He stayed with his mom for a little over 3 hours. They went out, kissed, and went their separate ways. I hid my head in the sand. Dad, I made important life decisions without participation and wisdom, the wisdom of my father. I will never regret my decision to join the army. I've grown up. I've grown up. I also decided that you and I will have the hardest conversation of my life when I get back. I'm going to tell my story sitting at the kitchen table with you and Mom. I'm tired of thinking of myself as a coward, but in case I don't come home, I want you to know the truth. With great admiration and dedication, I am now and always your loving son, Dan. 10 days after our meeting with the Alert Group, Dan was buried in our city cemetery with full military honors. The night before the funeral mass and the funeral, we held a wake for our son. The procession of family members, friends, and acquaintances lasted 2 hours longer than the set time. I think every Marine who has ever served and lived within a 100-kilometer radius has come to pay their respects. It was a relatively warm December day when Dan was lowered into the ground. Most of the traditional pomp and ceremony went unnoticed for me, as my grief was unbearable. It was on that day that I truly realized the horror of the war. Fathers and mothers are forced to bury their children. Since Dawn and I became the owners of the empty nest, she and I have dined at her family's house every Monday evening. I liked Pat and Mary, my father-in-law and mother-in-law, and I was looking forward to a new family ritual. Dawn got into the habit of coming in at 4:30 and helping her mom cook. This week I arrived 30 minutes earlier than usual, at 6 p.m., and parked a few houses away. I watched from my car as 15 minutes later the bailiff came to the front door of my relative's house. There was a slight commotion at the front door as the bailiff backed towards her car. I waited a few minutes and, taking a deep breath, started the car, pulled into the driveway, and headed for the lion's den. When I walked in the front door, I wasn't surprised to see Dawn, Pat, and Mary sitting together on the couch in the living room. They were going through the divorce papers together. 3 pairs of eyes stared at me as I entered the living room and threw my coat on the nearest chair. "We hang our coats in the closet in this house," Pat bellowed, and the women continued to stare at me. Walking across the room to the bar in the corner and pouring myself an unhealthy amount of very good bourbon, I said, "I won't stay long." I took the first sip and was not surprised when Pat stood up and turned to face me. Before he could say anything, I reached into my back pocket, pulled out a copy of Dan's letter, and handed it to Dawn. He sat down next to his daughter, and the 3 of them read Dan's words. After a few seconds, the paper trembled, and then sobs were heard. I admit, I was shocked when Marine Sergeant Major Patrick Franklin, retired, began to sob convulsively with his wife and daughter. "Get a lawyer and sign the damn papers. Don't call. Not write. Don't send SMS. I have 2 suitcases with winter clothes in my car. I'll leave them in the driveway. I'm going on vacation next week. I expect that everything you need will be taken out of the house so that I can sell it." After taking another throat-burning sip of my drink, I finished, "I hope he was a good guy. I hope that it was the best thing you had in your life, and that you have kept these fond memories ever since. I hope they will keep you warm in the future because you have lost your family." As Chris turned, grabbed his coat, and headed for the door, Dawn's kaleidoscope of thoughts began to clear up. She remembered the event with a capital letter. End.